Another thing that can really help you understand how styles are applied on a page are some of the visual aids in Dreamweaver. So let's go back to the actual Robin Eschner Barry Lopez books page, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson, is much more complex than the page we just created. I had you create a page with just this div of the letters from heaven and just this div collaboration with author Barry Lopez. And I put a couple photos in there to make it more interesting, but it's a much simpler page than the one you see here. So let's take a moment and study this page with the knowledge that we learned creating that simpler version and what you would need to do to create a page that's more complex. First, let me preview this in Firefox. And remember, one of the advantages of using Firefox when you're working with CSS is that you can choose to view the page with no style. So when I choose no style, you can immediately see the underlying structure of this document. And this should start making more sense to you now. You know we have a div at the top of this page called Top that has this image for our banner. We have another one called Nav that has all of our links. In this page, I have another div that defines all of the little rollover links to these graphics. And then I styled those also as an unordered list, because again, what I have here is a list of links. Then I have my Letters from Heaven story, and that's in its own div. And then finally, this collaboration with Barry Lopez piece, which is in its own div. And at the very bottom, the footer. So when I put the style back on, if I choose Page Style, Basic Page Styling, remember I created that very high div. I set the height very high on that green div at the bottom of the page so that the green continues down, even on a much larger monitor or a monitor set to a higher resolution. I've also used another rollover effect here, again using CSS to restyle an unordered list, but in this case I didn't use the display inline option that gets everything side by side up here. I just left it to the vertical alignment that's default to the UL. I used a border around this div to set it off a little bit from other elements on the page. And I used right and left image styles to align these images. So very similar to what we just did. That should all be familiar. But the biggest difference here is that the collaboration section up here is in one div, and this section about the book is in another div. And this collection of links is in one div, and this Letters from Heaven is in another div. And the way I got all of that aligned left and right, and I'll switch back over to Dreamweaver to help you see this, was by placing those divs inside of a bigger div. And here's a trick that can really help you see that, because when you start having so many divs on the page, it can be really confusing to try and understand what's inside of what and how they're controlled. But if you use the visual aids under the View menu and you choose CSS Layout Backgrounds, well, that's a colorful sight, huh? What Dreamweaver is trying to do now is trying to help you identify all of the different divs that are on this page to help you better understand what's happening behind the scenes. So you see the div that I created for the nav bar. You see a bigger div here in the background, this blue that's kind of showing through on the side and also appears here in the middle. And if I split the screen, we can start to see this even better. So we have our nav div, and then we have a div called Barry. And that surrounds Barry left. So let's scroll down here so you can see that that is Barry left. It's one div that creates the whole left column there. And inside Barry left, there are two other divs. There's a paintings div, and then below it, there's a div called Letters. And the way I've been able to position 4 different divs side by side in 2 columns was to have 2 divs that are floated to the left and floated to the right. That's div left, and then here you see Barry right. And then inside those divs, I placed the divs that contain this content. And I very carefully sized those divs so that they're exactly the same size, even though, for example, this one has a border. So the way I got this one the same size was to set a border around it, but just to set that border to white, because they both have the same thickness of border around them. Now, this is a fairly complex CSS layout, and it took a fair amount of thought to get it all to line up this way. But I wanted you to start to understand how you can assess how CSS works using things like the visual aids to help you understand positioning on the page. There's another useful CSS tool over here called Current. And when you select that, you'll be able to see what styles are applying to an element. So for example, this headline, which is formatted with an H1 tag, you can see exactly what's styling it. Here you see the page style for body is making it Verdana, but the line height is controlled by the div tag called privilege. The font size is also set in that div, and so are the margins. So I hope you can see here that using the Current tab in the CSS panel lets you better understand how styles are applied to each individual element, as opposed to the All tab, which shows you all of the styles that are attached to the page. And I think I'm done with this visual aid now, so let's just go back to View, Visual Aids, and turn that one off.